how much of your life was crafted by the church.
Who am I? I was this person in the past when I was in the church. Who am I now? That prescribed path is what the church wants you to be. It might not be who you are.
Back to Faith Unraveled. We're so excited to dive into our next episode of our Faith Deconstruction series. Today, we're going to be asking the big question, who am I after a faith crisis? Today, we're going to be talking about unraveling your identity after a religious deconstruction, which can be one of the most daunting and terrifying experiences. We're going to be getting into topics around purity culture. We're going to be talking about patriarchy, deconstructing patriarchy for Jamie, deconstructing the idea of being told that you're special your whole life. Deconstructing our relationship, realizing that the church was kind of like a bad roommate in our relationship. And we're going to get into these topics in more detail in the future, but they all kind of overlap, especially talking about your personal identity, because these were all areas that were so central to your experience as a member of the church. Your sexuality, your marriage, your role as a human being, where you came from, where you're going. It's all written by the church. So deconstructing your faith, you're kind of left with, was nothing real? Who am I without the church?
Your role as a family member too was all part of this identity that you had from the very beginning. We were taught certain ways to run a family, and all that goes away also as part of this process.
Yeah, deconstructing from a high demand religion is interesting because you realize how much of your life was crafted by the church. And I don't know if people deconstructing from other faiths feel that way as much, but particularly my experience in Mormonism is that it crafted me as a human being. And the way that I saw the world, everything about my life was shaped by the church. And it was very destabilizing to deconstruct my faith because I really was left asking, who am I? And was nothing real? That is a quote from the Truman Show. And if you haven't watched the Truman Show, it's a good one to watch when you're going through deconstruction.
I was going to say, we compare a lot of what we do to the Truman Show. Like, you're in what we felt was a lie, and you're living this lie throughout your whole entire life, and you think it's totally real. Yeah. And then all of a sudden, something happens where you have the awakening, and then you have to figure out, like, who am I? I was this person in the past when I was in the church. Who am I now?
As a member of the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints, your religion isn't just a component of your life. Everything. It tells you that you were a child of God before you came and lived on the earth, that you made a decision to come and live here. And the fact that you were born into a Mormon family is evidence that you were among the most righteous spirits to live in the pre-existence. You were saved for these days, for these last days, to basically prepare the world for the ushering in of Jesus Christ, the second coming of Jesus Christ. So your role on earth is to proclaim the gospel, perfect the saints, and redeem the dead. So that is your purpose in life. And you have this special thing that everyone in the whole world who's ever lived, whoever will live, is going to need in order to have salvation. And you're part of this army of God to go forth and to bring the world the gospel. And so the way that I looked at it was that every part of my day should be somehow contributing to this big, important effort. And really, when I think about the way that I was taught to think about myself, the way that I was taught to think about my role as a mother, raising up priesthood holders and future mothers, everything about my life was shaped by this worldview.
Yeah, the church called it enduring to the end, right? Certain activities throughout your whole entire life, and it's all wrapped around the church. Everything is wrapped around the church, and you walk that path when you're in your teens, you walk that path when you're having kids, you walk that path when the kids leave, and then you continue to walk that path until you get old. You don't necessarily have a lot of time to do anything outside of that. And so it's all encompassing when you're raising your kids. And then when you're younger, you're going on a mission or you're going to EFY. And so from the very beginning points of your life to the very end, you're enduring to the end and following the church's path. If you're not following that prescribed path, you also start feeling guilt and shame if you're going off in different areas. And that path might not be who you are really inside.
Right.
That prescribed path is what the church wants you to be, not necessarily what you are.
Who I was as a person that the church had crafted was very different than who I would have been without that component. So who I am now after 4 years of deconstructing has a lot to do with going back and doing a lot of work. And we're going to talk about what that was. We're going to talk about the tools that we've used over the last 4 years to try to basically discover ourselves. What we're going to do is start off this episode talking about ways during childhood that the church really crafted who we became as human beings. Then we're going to talk about our adult life and how those roles impacted our relationship and our lives together. And then we're going to talk about the deconstruction of those identities and how we have since rebuilt them. And we're going to share some of our favorite tools, some of the resources that we've used in the process. We've basically been like a trial and error through the whole thing, but nothing has been useless.
And again, there isn't one path that's the right path.
Right.
So I might do something very different than the way that Alicia has done it. And both of them are totally correct. And so part of this process is getting to being comfortable in the unknown and also being comfortable that there's many different paths. There's not really one right path to do it. So whatever way you take is your path that you need to do. Whatever way I take is the path I need to do. I have to hold space for that, and you hold space for me too.
Would it also be safe to say that we at least had some boundaries that we both agreed to?
Yeah. Yeah.
There probably are a lot of situations where one person in the relationship says, I really feel like that I need to have X in order to be fulfilled. I need to explore this avenue. And that might not be something that works for the other partner. So that's a time that maybe getting a therapist or a really good life coach can be helpful, because it's tough when you're both trying to find who you are for the first time, to try to assess what's reasonable, what's not reasonable, what's quote normal, what's, not normal. And the exploration process can be a little scary. I mean, when you're talking about introducing potentially substances for the first time, and this is why looking at outside resources from experts are a really good idea. What Elizabeth Gilbert says is that when you get to the bottom of yourself, it's okay to flag someone else. Could be an author, could be a therapist. This process, you are going to get to the bottom of yourself at some point here. So it's okay to reach out. Okay. Why don't we go ahead and start with the origin stories? So, do you want me to take the lead on the origin story?
Why don't you go with your background?
Okay. So I was raised in a family that were kind of, I always say like cool Mormons. Like it wasn't super or overly orthodox. We always went to church. We were never inactive growing up, but like my mom didn't care about things like bikinis. She wasn't overly strict. But what happened to me was that because of my parents' divorce at an early age, I really became fixated on this idea of an eternal family, because I always identified that as a source of deficiency in me, that my family wasn't going to be eternal because of the divorce. And I didn't know how all that was going to work out. When I was 12, I went to live in Oregon with my aunt and uncle. And that was a pretty pivotal year for me. It was a really important growth year. It was really good for my self-esteem. My aunt and uncle are amazing. And it was also the year that I became really committed to having a testimony of the church. And there is one particular occasion that we were in a young women's lesson, and the teacher asked us to close our eyes and to meditate on the notion that we lived before we came to earth in the pre-existence with Heavenly Father, that we chose to come and live here now. And now we have a sacred obligation to live the gospel and to bring others into salvation. I was so converted to this idea. It also happened to be the year that I was introduced to something called Saturday's Warriors, which is sort of Mormon folklore. It's the fictional presentation of this idea of living before you came to earth that really shaped my worldview. I was a spirit that came to earth with a very particular mission, and that it was my obligation to fulfill this mission. After a year of living with my aunt and uncle, I went back to live with my mom in Arizona. And during that time period, I kind of got into having like boyfriends. And I look at the church as almost a safety net for me at that point, because I really was seeking kind of love and attention from boys. And I think it could have been a lot worse than it was, because it was basically just make out sessions. But these intimate situations that I was having with boyfriends here and there as I went into my teenage life, paired with the messages that I was getting at like EFY summer camp, it was just a recipe for shame, for complete self-esteem disaster. So you'd go to EFY during the summer and you go to these lessons where you're taught that your body isn't even your own, that this is a sacred gift from Heavenly Father. It's not something you mess with.
Your body's the temple, right?
Your body is the temple, yes.
And the temple is of God, right? So.
And if you do something inappropriate with your body, like you share it with someone else or you touch yourself inappropriately, that is not even under your jurisdiction for something that you can repent for.
Yeah.
You have to go see the bishop for that. So here I was, the very beginnings of scrupulosity in me as a teenager. I'm going into the bishop and I'm confessing this stuff to the bishop. Oh, I made out with this boyfriend and then the shirt came off, and, you know, and he's asking all these really detailed questions. And what that does for me is it plants this idea that I am deficient. That was number one, the idea that I was deficient. Number two, that my body is not my own. I would later in my life have to reclaim ownership of my body because I was taught that my body was not my own. That was a huge part of my healing process. I was taught that I didn't even have jurisdiction over my own body if I were to touch myself or if someone else were to touch me, that was not something that I could just take care of between me and God and repentance process. That was something that had to be reported to the bishop in detail to allow him to initiate a consequence for me, which I put myself through over and over again. And eventually I moved out to California because I had this boyfriend that I just couldn't let go of. I kept getting into trouble with him. And so moved out to California. The experience that I had here just sort of reinforced my deficiency. The church completely had ownership over my body, my thought process. I feel like in this early age, the church was kind of crafting who I was. And now that I look back on it, I'm like, holy shit, the church crafts members to be exactly what they need to benefit their organization.
Their archetype.
Yeah. And that is to serve the organization. It's to keep all of this going. And so when you realize that they're doing this at the expense of human beings, I mean, it's really a tragedy. So EFY is what sort of initiates the bishop's repentance process. I meet you at the singles ward. We get married. I go through the temple for the first time. I get an initiatory that blesses my ears so that I may always hear the counsel of my husband. I then covenant to hearken unto my husband. And when we get married, I give myself unto my husband as you gave yourself to the Lord. Yeah. So in my mind, there is always a priesthood holder. There's always a man to default to. Yeah. Always. And so what does this do to me as a woman? It teaches me to outsource my discernment. And so now I have conditioned myself to hear him in every instance. The church is inserting itself to put their guidance in front of your own. So
you stopped listening to your own intuition and you just followed the church and became obedient.
I can't remember a time that I really truly trusted my own intuition. That's how bad it is. That's how long and pervasive this has been. Because look, this is the way that things roll out for us as women. The priesthood presides over us. So in your home, you have a husband who presides over you. If you're a young women's leader, you have a bishop that presides over you. There's always someone. It's always a man. And for us, this introduced a really tricky dynamic because I'm looking at you as the gateway to God. And I'm waiting for you to say, I've come from the mountain. I've prayed for our family. I've received revelation that this is what we need to do. And you never once did that.
Yeah. It's interesting because you weren't raised like that too. There were not gender specific roles in your family. Your dad cooked, cleaned. He was a single dad. Your mom was a single mom because they were divorced at a certain point in time in your life. And there were not necessarily gender roles because of how the dynamics of your family.
It's so true. And now I look at that as like a very healthy dynamic, seeing my dad do everything and seeing my mom do everything. And just because they were divorced, and there was never an expectation that I was going to do a certain route because I was a girl. Like I had both of my parents' support on eventually going to law school. I mean, that was kind of the plan that I had. But because the church had engendered this intense sense of deficiency in me, I equated that family dynamic to that deficiency. And so in order to correct that, I needed to really apply the church's prescription to absolve myself from this deficiency.
To our relationship, to our family, right?
Yep, absolutely. And so I was always waiting for you to take the reins, say, I've prayed about this, Alicia. I really feel concretely that this is what we're supposed to do. But I didn't see you voraciously reading your scriptures like in the same way that I was. I saw you whipping up your lesson Sunday morning, maybe even during sacrament meeting. I saw you like scarcely preparing for a talk. Like I just didn't see the deep dive that I was always doing. And so I just thought, like, is he going to do this whole priesthood thing? Like, come on. I'm waiting for you to do it. And I want to follow someone. I wanted someone to kind of like put me in my place. Is that terrible?
So you might have wanted that, but your actions outside of that was not like that at all. Like if I started to do that, I think we would have had conflict, a lot more conflict in our relationship. If I started like, well, maybe if I was reading my scriptures, going to the temple on a weekly basis, if I was bringing the family together from a family home evening perspective, I didn't do that as much as you would have preferred. And maybe if I raised my dedication level or my orthodox level to a certain level, then maybe that was the case, but that wasn't just who I was. And so I could never be able to hit that mark because that's just not me. That's not the way I wanted to be.
And it's interesting to think about now how we kind of both revolted from the way that we were raised. So you were raised in a very patriarchal household, and I was raised with divorced parents, and they were like, yeah, we go to church. We feel like it's good for us. But like, I mean, you don't have to be crazy about it or anything.
Just to give a little bit of background on my origin, as you said, I was raised in a very patriarchal family. My mom, first was a homemaker. My dad would come home at 5 o'clock. She would have dinner on the table for my dad. We would all eat as a family. We would have to be asked to get, up and leave the table. And my dad would be the one that kind of operated the whole entire family. We knew he was the patriarch. That's what we called. I was the oldest of the family, and my dad would always say, "You're the ark of the family." Meaning you are the next in line. You would be the one that kind of guides it. And so from a very young age, I was taught that not that I had more power than my mom, but that I had some kind of...
You were special.
Yeah, guidance and direction for the family outside of just because I was the firstborn and I was a male. So,
do you remember the first whisperings of you are a priesthood holder?
That came in like primary. You start learning, like, I think, so when we were kids, we were Gen Xers. we had what we called Blazers and Mary Miss. And prior to getting the priesthood when you're 12, and that's the Aaronic priesthood, we were taught early on that this priesthood was this authority to act in God's name. It was this special power that only men got in the church, and that at some point in time that you would be leaders down the road. You passed the sacrament. When you became a youth, you would bless the sacrament as you became a priest, and then as a teacher, which is the middle of the two, you would then prepare the sacrament. So you would have all this authority at that point in time. You would also then start your home teaching assignments with other men, and you would then go out and visit families. So all this became who you were at a very young age, and the church was teaching you a structure at that point in time. When I lived in Kansas, so I lived in Kansas for 4 years of my life, we drove 45 minutes to church. That's how critical church was on Sundays, and we spend 3 hours there and then drive another 45 minutes back. So that's a total of 5 hours just right there dedicated to church. And because we were in such a big area, we used to home teach people 45 minutes away. We would drive long distances to home teaching. So church was always very part of our life from the earliest memories of my life.
Now, last week, we talked about this curse that was supposedly placed upon your family from Joseph Smith because they were part of the original anti-Mormons in Nauvoo, right? Yeah. And so I wonder, did you have a degree of feeling special because you were one of the people in your family among your cousins that joined the church?
Yeah, there's that was the case. We had my uncle joined first, and then he converted my dad when he was, I think, in his 20s, early 20s.
Both Masons, right?
I don't know if I don't know if they both were Masons or not. I definitely know my dad became a Mason because of my Uncle Bill who challenged him. And then my mom, she's the only member on her side of the family. So when we would go visit cousins and aunts and uncles, none of them were really members of the church. And so, yeah, the church teaches you're special, right? They teach that you're one of the elect. And so you had this thought process of being an elect person by being a member of the church and being born in the church, and that your parents did convert to this religion. And so it does breed a sense of superiority. And so you have that feeling throughout your whole entire life. And you have this structure that you learn from a little kid. You just take that structure and you take it to the mission. That same structure that you learned in your primary and your youth programs, you're going on your mission, you just pull that structure with you. So on the mission, we were zone leaders and district leaders. None of the women were in leadership callings. The women did report into the zone leaders and district leaders, but they didn't have any type of authority within that structure. Eventually, we had a great mission president that brought in a sister leadership, which was over the other sisters, which I think was my mission president trying to empower the women. So I loved my mission president there and what he was doing there. But he also taught that the priesthood did provide the leadership for the organization and that the women needed to follow the priesthood. And that was a message that was taught on our missions. And so, again, now getting married, I just pulled that same structure into our marriage. But what was interesting is I started to operate in that structure with you. It didn't align with who you were. Even though that you wanted it, there was times where you were like, you've always been your own person and you've always been, this is my path. And I also never felt like it really fit well with me. I never felt like I needed to me, if you're operating in a team mode, no one's better than one another.
Well, I was going to say, I think our expectations for priesthood in the home were very different.
Yeah.
I didn't have gender roles attached to that. And I think you did.
I did.
So like one person is going to do the cooking and cleaning and the other one is going to go earn a living.
Yeah.
But like those aren't going to cross over at some point. And so I think that was where the misunderstanding was. What I wanted was more leadership on, we're going to have family home evening. Hey, I just have this feeling we should go to the temple tonight. Let's go to the temple. Or like, just like those kinds of things, like more on a spiritual level, where for you, it was more in like gender roles.
Gender roles, because that's the way we were taught.
Right. And I think always in my mind, I was kind of raised to have more feminist ideals that like, there's nothing wrong with a husband cooking dinner and giving the kids a bath and getting them off to bed. Where for you, that was part of your priesthood. Like that's not what men do.
Yeah.
So I think that's where the conflict maybe came in with that.
I don't know if it was part of the priesthood, because I think the priesthood doesn't dictate that really. I think the priesthood lessons that we had were that we do want to help, but that was the way I was raised. And so I had to differentiate the way I was raised versus the way the church is teaching versus the way that you wanted the home to operate also.
Yeah, I actually love this topic. A friend had brought to my attention that even if both people in the relationship are totally full force, they might have different ideas about how to apply the gospel principles. Mm-hmm. So let's say you've got like two siblings in the same family and they get together on a Sunday afternoon and one family is fine with them swimming and the other one's like, we don't swim on Sundays. So even if you've got people within the same faith, you've got still the church kind of squeezing itself in as a wedge, just merely because people have a different interpretation of the gospel and how to apply it.
Yeah. I remember there was a point in time in our marriage where we were living in low-income housing. We were going to college because we got married at 22 and 18. You were 18 years old. I was 22. We were still you were just going into college. I think that was your first semester into college when we got married. And I was off my mission. And because I messed around my first year prior to my mission, messed around in school, didn't focus on school, I got 2 D's and an F. That was my first semester at college. I had to pretty much retake college all over again that first year, and so we were pretty much starting at the same point in time when I came off my mission. So we were struggling
to keep our heads above water.
It was a struggle to be able to live in California on a very minimal income. There was times where we both worked. There was times where I had multiple jobs just to keep our family going. And there was times where we had to go into debt because we paid our tithing, right? We paid the 10% tithing and we knew we didn't have enough money.
I was super lucky that my dad had set aside money for college. So at least my college was paid for, but to be able to go to school. And then we ended up getting pregnant right away.
Yeah.
And it's like, well, you've got the counsel to start a family. And so, but I'm like, gosh, I'm getting this money for college. I don't want to like let that go to waste. So, but yeah, we were just constantly struggling to keep our heads above water.
There was many times where we didn't have enough money to pay tithing and we went into debt every month.
So that we could pay tithing.
Yeah. And it wasn't because we weren't budgeting. We had a really strict budget because we didn't have a lot of money. We just didn't have enough money to operate on our needs. And so every month we go into debt. Yeah. Even after we were married for 5 or 6 years and we had a baby and we were struggling making our ends meet, the church was kind of forcing us in a certain direction, not allowing us to use our own intuition, not allowing us to be able to figure out how to make ends meet, but forcing a path for you and for me that we needed to grow. And if it caused us to go into debt, we just have to figure out a way and God would provide some way, right?
Yeah, that's why I think the analogy of the box is really interesting because you're always trying to fit into the box. And it's like you got to reconfigure it however you can to fit in there, even if that means going into debt or just doing crazy things, spending lots of time away, things that you wouldn't ordinarily do if you were just using your own discernment, but you're trying so hard to stay within the church's configuration that you end up disowning your own inner guidance in the process.
Your own intuition, for sure.
Yeah. So now we're going to talk about the rebuild. For me, waking up from my indoctrination, like in my sudden faith crisis moment when I found all this stuff and I was like, oh my gosh, I don't think the church is true. I didn't see all of this at once. It actually took years to unpack it. It's kind of like you woke up from a car accident and you didn't know what happened. My first dive into Luna Corbden's recovering agency was when I realized, like, oh my gosh, I didn't have my own agency. Like, how much of me is me because of the church? How much of myself was crafted with the church's agenda? And I don't mean to say that that was all bad. There's parts that I love about myself that the church helped craft, but there are also things that I don't need to keep anymore. And there's also parts of me that are devastating to look at because I was not connected to my own body because of the church. And I lived in this state of perpetual deficiency because of the church. And so untangling all of that has been a really huge part of the healing process for me.
Yeah, for me, I found myself in what I called an identity crisis, where everything I knew about myself, even though I didn't want it, like I was still, we talked about a 6 out of 10. I found myself still feeling like who I was because of the church. All my values were of the church. What was important to me as an eternal perspective was because of the church. My relationship with you was all driven because of the church, right? We met at a singles ward. We got married at 18 and 22 because that's what we do as members of the church. We get married at a very young age. The way we raised our kids with the value systems of the church, we taught them the word of wisdom. We taught them about tithing. We taught them about the eternal perspective, and all that is now gone. So the relationships with the kids, you have to start reevaluating what is your new relationships with you and what with my children.
Every particle of who I am was built with materials that were given to me by the church.
Yes.
Like every part of me. And that's why when people come into the comments and say, you left the church, but you just can't leave it alone, I just want to say, like, every part of me is because of Mormonism. Like, I was born into this. This is who I am. In order to walk away, I have to burn this all down. Like, you can't reconstruct something until you destroy it. You literally have to take it apart. And taking apart your religious beliefs is interesting. It's painful. There's nothing like having to take apart your identity. There's nothing like having to burn your identity down. The biggest thing that I want to say to people is that if you're going through this process, you're going to feel hopeless at times, and you're going to get through it. There is a light at the end of this tunnel, but the destroying yourself in the effort to rebuild is a necessary part of the process. What we're going to bring now are the things that have worked for us, but we want to see in the comments, what are things that you are doing that are working for you? Is it therapy? Is it books? Is it a certain author?
I felt completely lost. When I hit that second year and Christianity fell for me, I started feel like I was drowning. Mm-hmm. I was reaching for anybody just to stabilize myself. I was so dysregulated. I'm not an emotional person, but during that year and a half, I found myself crying in the weirdest spots. And someone said, hey, I think you're going through a grieving process. I don't think I was going through a grieving process because I didn't necessarily grieve leaving the church. I think what I was experiencing was a loss of who I was. And as I looked back over the many years, I found like myself was all tied into the church. And as I started unraveling the different pieces of it, I felt like I was unraveling myself.
Even just saying just now, I'm not an emotional person. You weren't an emotional person inside the church.
No,
you might actually be quite in touch with your emotions now as someone who's deconstructed.
Yeah. And we talked about like prior to me going on a mission, I was a very extroverted person. Even prior to our marriage, I was very extroverted, social, loved to dance, loved to party, loved just the environment of, Brene Brown calls it wholehearted living. The last guidepost is to dance and have fun. And so I feel like I've always been like that. And now I'm getting back to...
You lost it.
I lost it. I completely lost it. And I don't know how I lost it. I really don't. I remember a conversation with one of our friends and she was saying, yeah, Jamie was super extroverted when we were in the singles ward. And then I come to get married and it
just got serious.
It got really serious. I was no longer fun. I lost like who I was when I was a kid. And so I had to go reach back to those periods of time and say, okay, Jamie, who were you during your prior to your mission, or who were you right after your mission, so that I could start figuring out and anchoring to something. I tried to anchor to you, right?
How did that go?
It didn't go well. It didn't go well. And the reason why I tried to anchor to her was just because I was drowning. I felt like my whole world was coming apart and I just didn't know how to stop the swirl. And so I tried to anchor to certain things so I could just get my head above water and say, okay, I'm okay. I'm feeling okay. I can start moving forward now. And because my mind was in such a whirlwind that I was having a hard time like stabilizing myself. Like I said, I was in meetings and I was crying in meetings. And luckily we're in the pandemic and I was on Teams and I can pull myself off of that. I remember being at a conference and walking to one of our sessions and I was just bawling and I had to just go back and say, I can't do this. Like this is, and I have to operate at work. I have to figure out how to operate at work, and work has always been my identity. So I was able to at least anchor to that to some certain extent, but I still felt like as a father, I didn't know what to be as a father. I felt like as a good partner, I didn't know what to be as a good partner. And I didn't know who I was. And so during that period of time, it was painful. It was a struggle. And I had to figure out tools to be able to get out that. I know we wanted to talk about the tools that we came with to be able to build that platform so that we could reconstruct.
Well, you really hit it when you talked about going back to who was I before the church kind of took over my identity. Yeah. And for you immediately went to that, like, I love to party. I love to have a good time. I love to dance. Like when we first started, we were actually dancing together all the time. We would go out dancing. We were doing the swing dancing thing. We ended up teaching and doing a whole thing with like performing and did some commercials and all this fun stuff. And a big part of our rebuild has been like rediscovering that and incorporating that into our lives. You were also the person in the singles ward that was always planning things. So you would have like this whole agenda, and that was lost for the 20 plus years that we were married. Like you didn't really plan anything. And I think so much of that was probably the stress of being a single breadwinner and doing, meeting all these expectations that you just kind of lose yourself in the process of it. So Luna Corbden has this list of expectations that are given to every member, from family home evening to temple visits to ministry assignments and you would not believe there's literally dozens of things. And so it's almost as if you are so inundated with expectations and like the hamster wheel of Mormonism that you don't even pay attention to your identity or your personal needs or your connection with your own body, which we're going to talk about next. So the first phase was just getting in touch with who was I as a child. That's who I need to get back in touch with right now, because I really believe that who you were as a little child or as a teenager is who you are inherently. So what were the things that you loved to do during those times? What were you exploring? What were you interested in? Because I feel like creativity is a huge part of the healing process. It has been probably the biggest part of the healing process for me. Curiosity and creativity, that can be through dance. It can be through hobby, hiking, or maybe it's something artistic like photography or something else. Get back into those things so that you can get back in touch with who you are.
Yeah, one of the things that was interesting for me is I went from being extroverted to introverted, and now I would say I'm back to an extrovert type of personality.
Could we go as far as to say that you were introverted only because who you were and what you had to offer?
I wasn't comfortable with.
You weren't comfortable with.
Yeah, I wasn't. I feel like looking back on myself now for those years that we were married and in the church, I feel like I tried to fit myself into that box, and that box was not who you were, who I was. And so I had to adjust myself to be able to fit that. And there was a lot of pressure and anxiety that came with being that person in the box. And so as I unraveled this, I found, like, number one, that anxiety was able to get under control, and we can talk about that. We went through a life coaching situation. Alicia got her life coaching certification, and I was, during the identity crisis, my anxiety was up and down, peaking on a regular basis, and you had worked with me such that I could identify it and start controlling it. And that was a huge, like, stabilization for me. Once we did that, I was starting to understand and recognize when I would go through these peaks and valleys, and I was able to understand what caused them and then get them back under control.
Just from the outside looking in, what it appeared to me is that you were entering these pockets of dysregulation and you had no inner core to hold on to.
You're totally right.
So you're trying to hold on to all these external sources. And what happened was, I've worked as a coach for years, but I went in to get this specific certification that I was hoping to be able to bring to my coaching practice. And I learned about integration and sensory awareness. So as my partner, you were one of my practice clients, and we did this sensory awareness exercise with you. And in this process, you ask the person where they're feeling some sort of discomfort or dis-ease. So maybe they've got like an anxiety, or maybe they've got like a fear or a stress. And so you ask them where that's coming up in their body. Do they feel it somewhere in their body? And this, for some people, is the first time that they've ever like really thought about their body.
Yeah.
Like, for you, was it kind of the first time that you'd ever sat and thinking about, like, oh, this is how my chest feels right now. This is how my stomach feels right now.
And the reason why is the church teaches. So again, we're Gen Xers, right? So we were raised during a period of time. McConkie was big. And I was taught that mental health, when you have mental health issues, whether that's depression, anxiety, whatever, it could all be overcome by reading the Book of Mormon.
Yeah.
In that, there is no tools in the freaking Book of Mormon that helps you get over some of these things. And until I finally was able to work with you, was I able to recognize it, understand it, and then get it back under control.
There's a statement, I don't know if it's Ezra Taft Benson or who it is, but it's basically, the study of scripture will do more to change behavior than the study of behavior. And I just remember always thinking that, like, if anything's going wrong in my marriage, I just need to read my scriptures more. I was taught at EFY that every problem that you have in the whole entire world can be solved with something in the Book of Mormon. And so you were just constantly defaulting to that. So I'm using you as a test client for this sensory awareness. And you're like, wow, this is the first time in my whole life that I've ever sat and thought about that my anxiety actually, I can feel it somewhere in my body, and I can identify where it is, and I can imagine what it would look like. And I can actually get control of it, because now I recognize when it's coming. And that sensory awareness for you, I feel was monumental.
Was huge. And I've always been a higher anxiety type of person. It enabled me to find tools to be able to get it under control. And so if you're going through an identity crisis or going through this process and you find yourself in depression or find yourself with high anxiety, it's okay to do therapy. It's okay to find a life coach to work through this stuff, because some of the stuff, I don't think I could have been able to work through this without alone. I really don't. I felt like I needed someone to help me work through it. So, and that wasn't just it. I also developed friendships. We had Marco Polo groups. I started understanding how other people were working through some of their stuff.
Would you say that the meditation, so you have established like a very concrete meditation practice that you're more committed to than you were ever committed to prayer or scripture? And what I'm wondering is, does the sensory awareness now tie in with your meditation?
Yes, 100%. So what Alicia's talking about is almost every morning I go into a 10-minute meditation, and it's all about being, I learned by going into that meditation, I can handle the anxiety a lot better. And so that is now one of the tools I use on a daily basis to keep my anxiety in control. And now I think I do it beyond just the anxiety. I do it more for just getting my mind and being able to flow my emotions through my mind. And so I do it way beyond just the anxiety piece now. And part of that leads into the other tools that I was using. I read Eckhart Tolle, I read Michael Singer, and Nicole, I forget her last name, How to Do the Work.
Holistic psychologist on Instagram, life-changing. Her book, How to Do the Work, is life-changing. One of the things I wanted to add too, when you talk about I could handle the anxiety better, all these tools kind of mingle together, and we can tell you in the show notes like what our favorite tools were, because we read a lot of books. Some of them were like take it or they were all take it or leave it. But I feel like we came up with a little bit of something from each one. And there were other parts of them, like we both love Gary Zukav, but he's like very solidly into like reincarnation and the soul journey. And I'm not sure if I believe in all of that, but I love his ideas about
evolution of the soul.
Yeah, the evolution of the soul. And maybe like I just kind of think, well, I'm still sort of agnostic, but I think these ideas are beautiful. You can take them or leave them. But Michael Singer talked about in the Untethered Soul, this idea of opening up like your heart chakra, also kind of a wooey idea, but like just if you imagine it from like just a sensory experience, like opening your heart and allowing this emotion to come in. And it's not about toxic positivity where you shut it out and you go like, oh, this is a bad emotion. I don't want to experience this emotion. Also what we're going to talk about in our episode on toxic positivity, but you actually let that difficult emotion come in. He talks about this sensation of a burning and allowing it to just kind of like fuel in there and then like let it go. So it taught me how to like open this highway to give that difficult emotion validation and let it just flow right through you. And that's what your sensory and your meditation has really driven home for you, right?
And it's because the church teaches opposite of that. You're not supposed to feel emotion. It's about always like, if you chance to meet a frown, do not let it stay. Quickly turn it upside down and smile that frown away, right? It's about not feeling the emotion.
Absolutely.
And it's okay to feel the emotion. Now you're outside the church. It's okay that you're angry. It's okay that you're sad. And you can live in that emotion and let it flow through you. And the church teaches opposite of that. And so you don't get those tools to be able to handle like these types of situations properly as you step outside the box and you no longer have that structure anymore.
And by what we've described, it sounds like you're kind of inviting yourself to be this like very overly emotional person. But what actually ends up happening is the opposite, because this idea that Michael Singer presents is, and he's not a therapist, he's an entrepreneur, and he just kind of came up with some of these, his own practices, but they've been really useful to me, is that when you validate a tough emotion and you let it come in and you actually are able to like talk about it and feel it, then it's actually able to pass through much quicker. Whereas if you take it and bury it and you're like, oh, hell no, I'm not going there, then the idea is that will actually start to fester and you'll come up with all these adaptations to try to ignore it. And now you're building up all these walls. And in reality, I feel like our relationship has been so much more connected because we're both showing up in a much more authentic way.
Yeah.
We couldn't have done this without deconstructing our identity. So share your statement about when the person does the work, it affects the relationship, and when the relationship. Yeah. Tell us that quote.
Well, I don't know if this is
a realization. It's very simple, but it's so good.
When you're able to do the work individually, you can show up in ways that you're a better person, and that allows you to have a better relationship, and then that relationship is better. So because that relationship's better, you're showing up better in the family.
Right.
And
so you heal the person, you heal the relationship, you heal the relationship, you heal the family.
And what it ended up happening too as part of this identity crisis, as I realized my faults that were either just me, myself, or faults that were driven from the church, I felt like I needed to apologize. And so I apologized to you. I went to all three of my kids and apologized to them. And and my daughter said this weekend. She's like, Dad, you are so different now than you were prior to your faith crisis. And it hurts a little bit, right? Because I was probably not as authentic in my relationship with my children during that period of time. But what's nice now is that she really appreciates the relationship now. And I hear that from both my other two sons too. And part of it is, I don't know how much that structure the church teaches allows you to be authentic, because you have that toxic positivity. You're not showing emotions. I think being vulnerable, like Brené Brown's talking about vulnerability, is very key. Being vulnerable in relationships, I think, are very important. Allows you to be on an authentic connection that you normally don't have if you don't have that vulnerability. And so these are all the tools that I started to incorporate in my life to gain that identity. I started stabilizing myself, developing that foundation, and that foundation allowed me to continue to find tools to grow from that foundation. It allowed me to have a better relationship, a better marriage, a better connection with my kids. The other thing I realized is that there's only a few things in this life that really matters. And one of the things is connection with my spouse, connection with my kids, connection with friends, connections in work, and showing up authentically is very important to me.
A couple things that come to mind for me as I've personally started to deconstruct this stuff, what I realized is that I was heavily masked up in the church, presenting only what I felt like was presentable to the world. And so I feel like I was never able to show up in a friendship the right way. I feel like I was constantly walking around with this mask. And I want to mention that not everyone in the church does this. For whatever reason, I've deconstructed, and this is part of what I've deconstructed, that I was not authentically myself in the church. There might be lots of members of the church that feel like they can present themselves authentically. I see people having lots of authentic relationships, and they're in the church. So, but for me, this is how it's impacted me. The other thing that occurs to me that I think is important for people to hear if they're about to enter this process of opening up, becoming more vulnerable, is that you go through kind of a little bit of a messy stage.
Oh, yeah.
And the thing that always stood out to me was like the oversharing. Like you go into this space where you're like, I've never been vulnerable before. And it feels so good to know that I can be authentically me. And then inevitably you're going to overshare with someone.
But that's okay.
It's okay. You're going to go through.
It's part of the process. You'll learn when not to overshare. But I do think
there's growing pains.
Exactly. There's growing pains.
That are part of it.
Yeah. The other thing I think that helped me stabilize is being comfortable in the unknown. That was huge in my stabilization too, because once you lose the eternal perspective, you like, what is this life for? Right. And so you then start like doing research on, okay, what is this life for? And you find out like, you don't know. You will never know. Like when I die, I will not know what the purpose of this life is. And someone can say, yeah, I know what this purpose of life. They don't. I mean, there is no proof They could say God talked to me and told me what it is. That's fine. But I can probably prove whether or not this is a simulation. Are we a petri dish in an alien environment? I don't know. But I'm comfortable not knowing, and I'm fine with not knowing. I don't need to know that I'm going to be going to the celestial kingdom.
Yeah, it's very uncomfortable letting go of that assurance. But the reality is we don't have the choice.
We don't know.
I wanted to share a little bit. So we talked about creativity. We talked about curiosity. We talked about sensory awareness, vulnerability and authenticity, reading Michael Singer's Untethered Soul and the holistic psychologist, How to Do the Work. Another thing that I wanted to talk about, when I started to go into the deep dive of my childhood, and I started to go into this rescue process, which we identified in the very early phases of the rebuild as an important part of the process, getting back in touch with who we were as a child, as a teenager. I actually had to pull out pictures from my childhood, and I laid them out in my bedroom. I was able to find almost one picture per year of my life. And I just laid them out. It took up my entire room because I was 43 at the time. And I have to say, if you had a lot of childhood trauma, I would recommend doing this with the help of a therapist or someone who's trained. I did it on my own, and I laid all of the pictures out. And I left them there for probably a week, right? When you say that they were there for about a week. So that was nice of you to give me that space to do that. And each day I would get up and I would look at those pictures on the floor, and I would walk through each of those years of my childhood. And I incorporated that sensory awareness. And it's pretty amazing what will happen as you walk through each of those phases and you experience in your body what that year was like. That year that purity culture first became an issue for me. That year that I first identified myself as broken, that I first identified myself as deficient. And as I walked through each of these phases, that became very healing. And I was able to take a bird's eye view of my life that I had never seen before. I was able to see some of the hardships that had happened. I was able to see some of the pivotal moments, like, wow, this was the year that my testimony was really concretely made. And I've since asked people about this exercise, and I guess there's a therapeutic modality called narrative therapy. And I guess that's what this is. And for me, it was extraordinarily helpful in reframing, helping me to see things a little differently, helping me to conceptualize things that maybe my parents were going through at the time. And it really helped me to reframe, and also the integration process, which I would say is probably the last part of this reclaiming your identity, to take all of those parts and integrate them into who you are now. And some of that process can be really difficult because some of these things are not things that you want to keep. So you almost have to rebuild them in a way that suits you now. And there are definitely going to be things that, you're going to get rid of. Like, purity culture does not shape who I am today. Part of my healing process was also getting in touch with my own body and realizing I have been defaulting to the priesthood all these years. I have been outsourcing my intuition to my husband, my bishop, my stake president, the prophet, whomever. It was never with me. My say was never the final say. I didn't even really know how to make a decision in this process because I'm told from the time I'm young to default to the priesthood. And one of my community members on TikTok sent me a message that said, just think about the hashtag, hear him. You're inserting the church's voice in front of your own. You're constantly allowing the church to take precedence over your own intuition. And you have to remember that the church is the beneficiary of this. Each individual family is not going to benefit by the counsel of the prophet. In fact, there are families in the church that are harmed by the counsel of the prophet. So it's so critically important that we learn how to listen to our own intuition, that we learn how to trust ourselves. And this is not going to happen at once, especially if you're someone like me that had religious scrupulosity and prayed about what to wear. I mean, that's so embarrassing. That's so embarrassing to admit now, that I would pray about what to make for dinner. Please, Heavenly Father, help me to find like ingredients to make such and such. I didn't trust myself. So part of reclaiming myself was, number one, being able to listen to my own discernment, listen to my own intuition, whatever you want to call it, inner voice. Okay. And maybe for you, maybe that is about a higher power, but it's within you. That is within you. And number two, reclaiming my body. Your body is not your own. Even as a teenager, you're taught that touching your own body is not a matter that you can reconcile with God directly. You have to involve
go to a bishop.
Your bishop. Just think of that.
Yeah.
I did not believe that my body was my body. I believed that my body was a gift. It was temporary. It was for me to take care of. I wasn't able to connect with my body. So talking about who we are as teenagers, I had to reclaim my teenage sexuality, which I had been taught my whole life was wrong. That was actually the cause of my deficiency, was my sexual nature, my provocative nature, right? And now as an adult, part of becoming who I am is reclaiming who I was as a teenager. I love to wear sexy clothes. I love to dance provocatively. I love to listen to fun music and naughty music. I love to do that kind of thing. There's nothing wrong with that. That's part of who I am. And so part of that process, which was really tough, had to do with really opening myself up to insights from sex therapists. Natasha Helfer was a great support to me, just listening to podcast episodes and going to some of her talks and listening to her talk about body shame and body acceptance and sexuality individually and with a partner. Also listening to Sex with Emily. I mean, that it was a little shocking to listen to Sex with Emily. But that taught me how, first of all, it normalized a lot of things that were really stigmatized in my mind. So listening to Sex with Emily was a great first step to just realizing like sexuality is normal and there's lots that comes with it. I will say that I feel lucky that you and I had very similar boundaries. I think it would have been tough if one of us was like, I want to open the relationship, and the other was like, no, I don't want to do that. Like we both decided that like opening our relationship was not something that we wanted to do.
It's not a bad thing for those who want to do it. It's totally fine.
Right. If both people are on board for that. Yeah. So we decided that just wasn't something it wasn't a zone we were willing to like play in. But there's so much that you can do within your marriage. And we'll talk about this when we talk about purity culture, but there's so much that you can do within your marriage to explore sexuality without actually opening up your marriage. But again, for some people, that's going to be part of their journey. We know a lot of people that have opened their marriage, and that's part of their process. Some people also try it and then decide it's not the best. But I feel lucky that we were on board with that together. So,
can we talk about, you talked about how it was very difficult for you to make choices. You always look to the church to make the choice for you. Can you tell us what tools you integrated to be able to overcome that?
So I haven't overcome it yet. I'm still in this process. As you know, I wanted to start this podcast 2 years ago, and I would stand up and I would fall on my face again. And I would stand up and I would fall on my face again. And like, there've been a lot of tears shed over this, because I'm just like, what in the hell is wrong with me? And like when I said in my last episode, like I couldn't put one foot in front of the other. Part of it was that I lost my modalities for productivity, but another part of it was just like, I don't know who the hell I am. Yeah. I mean, everything that I valued doing in life had something to do with building up the kingdom of God. Everything. I mean, I framed everything that way. And now everything I'm doing is to tear down the kingdom of God.
At least that's what some people think.
I know. I feel like this is... no, that's totally a joke. I feel more purpose in this than perhaps anything else that I've ever done. Even though we're only on our 4th episode, but I am still in the process of learning how to trust myself. I'm constantly trying to overcome this.
Can you share some of the tools that you've at least used to be able to start trusting yourself?
Yeah, I would say the 10% rule is a really good one to go in with. It's about making very small incremental efforts that can expand into greater efforts. So it's basically like, stop thinking about it, just go do the dishes. Yeah. Stop thinking about it, just open your phone and make a TikTok, or just water the plants, or like just putting one foot in front of the other without like strategizing it. So just forcing yourself to do like the minimum, and that will sometimes blossom into more things. Yep. So like, do I have to sit here and spend all this time on what I'm going to wear today? Or I could just get a monochromatic wardrobe. And then because this is the other thing. No, you start deconstructing your identity. And then if you're me, you realize, oh my God, I'm ADHD, neurodivergent, maybe a little autistic. I'm definitely not neurotypical. Like now you start to really explore yourself, and you realize like, oh, wow, there's all kinds of exciting things. Some people realize they're not straight. Some people realize that they're gender fluid. I mean, so many things will come as a result of this identity rebuild. Yeah. And that can be really fun and exciting, but I hope that you have resources during the process, because it
could be a painful journey.
It can be a painful journey. Yeah. And I will say I have not mastered the art of making decisions. I have friendships. I have Marco Polo. I am an introvert.
Yeah, so that
was a surprise.
That was a switch. So she was extroverted. I was introverted while we were in the church.
We thought we were.
Yeah, we thought we were, and it is flipped. Now I'm more extroverted, and you're more.
And I would never leave the house if it were.
No, you would. She enjoys having fun. The only last thing I'd add is part of this process is to stay curious and experiment. I know that's part
within the boundaries that you and your partner have set for each other.
Within the boundaries, and if you go outside of those boundaries, it could be painful. So
we also have friends or family that have said, that's not something that I want to explore, but I'm comfortable with you exploring it if you need to.
Mm-hmm. I'm just talking about in general, like you could explore like substances, or like just going out and I love EDM music, like electric dance music. It's like one of my favorite things. I didn't know if you would like it or not. And that could have been like, hey, you're not allowed to go to concerts and do that. That's a boundary that the relationship might be there, but you were open for me.
We have like a small group of friends that I'm like very comfortable with. And so sometimes for an introvert, that can be really helpful, having just like a few, like a small group. Some of them were people that were in our stake beforehand that like one of us might have known growing up. Yeah. And it's just brought this really cool dimension to our lives, having these friends that we can talk to about lots of things.
Yeah, I have a missionary companion that has moved here like right next to us, and we do
and he has deconstructed too.
Yeah, he's deconstructed too, and we go out and do some of the stuff.
We're not doing any like when you say substances, I mean, you know,
alcohol.
There's like alcohol, and then like a lot of people that we know have gotten into like the plant medicines and stuff. And so, but we're not talking about like stuff that's going to create dependency. I think you have to be really careful with anything that's like addictive.
Well, and I'm just talking about also the going out and dancing. Like that wasn't something that we did in the church. Like,
one thing I want to add on the note of substances. So in the last episode, I mentioned that alcohol doesn't really love me. Like my microbiome doesn't do well with alcohol, but I do on occasion have a drink. I have like I don't do sugary drinks, but like once in a while I'll do like a club soda with a shot of tequila and not very much. But I want to say that even though as someone who's worked in the health and nutrition industry for the last like 15 years, there isn't anything healthful about alcohol. Like there's literally nothing about it that's good for you. But on like a spiritual, emotional level, just having now had a few evenings in my life where I've had a couple drinks, it almost like opened up a part of me that I didn't know existed. And it almost like showed me a part of myself that I didn't know was there. And same
you get
with
a bit extroverted in those realms.
Yeah. And actually what I would prefer is more like an edible. I'm more comfortable in the cannabis zone with having an edible for myself. But either one of those, like whether you're talking about alcohol or like cannabis, they've both opened something up in me that is a fun part of myself that like I didn't know existed. And it's helping me reclaim that teenage self that I really have yearned for. And so that's been an exciting.
I have seen it as a tool for you and integrating some of that inner child
but
work.
It's scary. You hear about people who have this like dopamine deficiency, if that's what it is. And the first drink of alcohol they have, they're like addicted to it. So
Everybody's
I think
different.
you got to know your family history. Yeah. There are people who become alcoholics. I mean, alcoholism is a real issue for a lot of people. But just because you have a drink like a couple nights a month doesn't mean you're an alcoholic. Yeah. So yeah. Is there anything else you want to add?
I think that's it for what I had.
Yeah, I feel like this has been just a really big part of our deconstruction.
This was the hardest part of the deconstruction for me.
And then everything else that we talk about, patriarchy, purity culture, like it
kind of ties to the identity.
It all ties to the identity. So we'll get into more detail about that. But please tell us in the comments, guys, if there's anything that you have used. Are there any tools that have helped you? Are there books that you would recommend to someone that's going through a faith crisis? Please tell us what those are in the comments. And we cannot wait to see you next week. Thank you so much for joining us on this deconstruction journey. And we'll see you next time.